There was no thunder tearing the sky open, no fire falling from paradise, no supernatural sign announcing that moment. But when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, breathed his last, the entire Muslim world seemed to freeze, not because the ground shook, but because what held every heart steady was suddenly gone. In a breathless, fragile instant, human history stepped into a darkness it had never had to face before. Faith existing without the living voice of revelation. Imagine what that felt like. A community that had just escaped the shadows of Jahiliyyah, that had only begun learning how to live by sacred law, that had finally found order for the soul, suddenly lost the only guide it had ever known. No one left to ask when doubt crept in. No one left to look toward when fear rose. No one left to say, "Do not worry, because Allah is with us." That silence was not peaceful. It was a vacuum of trial where if people had been even slightly weaker, an entire Ummah could have shattered in a matter of days. And right there, the most terrifying question in history began to echo, not as a sentence spoken out loud, but as a quiet fear inside every heart. What will keep us together now that the Prophet is gone? Can faith survive if it is no longer upheld by the presence of a prophet? Or will Islam, like so many movements in history, crack the moment its founder is no longer here? This is not only a moment of grief, this is the border between two eras. On one side is the era of revelation, when Allah guided people directly through a messenger. On the other side is the era of responsibility, when people must prove they deserve what they were given. From that moment on, your Islam would no longer be protected by miracles, but by the character of those who stood up to carry the trust. At that razor-thin intersection, a new chapter begins, not written by angels, not guided by revelation, written by the trembling decisions of people who feared Allah more than they feared losing power. Those people did not ascend through swords. They were not celebrated with thrones. They entered history with a burden heavier than any crown. The burden of keeping the Ummah from collapsing when the guiding light was no longer in front of their eyes. And if you think this is only a story of the past, you missed the most important point. Because that moment did not happen only in Medina more than 1400 years ago. That moment repeats in every age, every time a community has to ask, are we being led by faith or by people? By justice or by power? By trust or by ambition? Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we do not only retell history but peel back the moments when an entire civilization stands on the edge of collapse. If you are looking for stories that do not lull the conscience to sleep, that do not paint the past in soft colors but dare to face the truth even when that truth hurts, then you are in the right place, because what is coming is not the story of perfect heroes. This is the story of people who could not afford to fail. They lived in a moment where a single wrong decision could have snapped the path of Islam in two, and they knew it. They felt it in sleepless nights, in whispered prayers, and heavy footsteps weighed down by history. If you have ever wondered why Islam did not collapse after the Prophet, peace be upon him, I passed away, why a young community could stand firm through rebellion, division, and the temptations of power, and why those four names are still remembered as the standard of leadership to this day, then you should not leave. Subscribe to Prophetic History Explained and walk this path with us. Your support is not just a button, it is fuel that helps us keep digging, retelling, and protecting the stories that shape the faith of billions. Because this journey does not end in the past. It leads straight into the question every one of us must face today. When the guiding light is not standing in front of our eyes, what will we stand on? They did not step into power like victorious men. There was no coronation, no escort, no roar of a crowd. What awaited them was not a throne, but a weight strong enough to crush any ordinary person. And because after the Prophet, peace be upon him, left this world, Leadership in Islam was no longer an honor to desire, but a trust that should make a person tremble. In human history, power is usually seen as a reward. People fight for it, scheme to keep it, and use it to justify every mistake. But what was forming in Medina at that time ran completely against the familiar logic of mankind. The successors of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were not given authority because they wanted to rule, but because if they did not step forward, the Ummah could break apart. Power did not come to them like a trophy. It pressed down on their shoulders like a call they could not refuse. The title of the rightly guided caliphs is not a flattering label for history books. It is a harsh standard. Being rightly guided does not mean never making mistakes. It means knowing how to return to Allah when standing before the hardest choices. In that model of leadership, the leader is not above the community in worth, only above it in responsibility. They are not allowed to live more comfortably than the people because every privilege must be paid for with an answer before Allah. No rule allowed the caliph to stand outside the pain of the Ummah. If the people were hungry, the leader could not allow himself to be full. If the community was in turmoil, the one at the top could not sleep in peace. And if power began to harden the heart, then that same power would become evidence against him on the day of judgment. This was not a state built on military strength. It was an order built on the fear of Allah. What made this model different was not its form, but its motive. And the caliphs did not rule to carve their names into history. They ruled with the awareness that history might forget them, but Allah never will. Every decision was weighed not only by political effectiveness, but by a quiet question. If I stood before Allah today, could I justify this? That is why leadership in this era was never easy. It was a chain of choices between what is right and what is convenient, between justice and false stability, between being loved and doing what must be done. Those who entered the role of caliph understood that power would expose them more than it would anyone else. It does not hide flaws. It strips them bare. Only those with a solid moral foundation can stand under that exposure. Notice this: none of them chased the position. They hesitated. That hesitation was not weakness, and it was proof of deep responsibility. People who crave power are often blind to its consequences. People who fear power understand its price better than anyone. And those who fear it are often the ones most worthy to carry the trust. In a world where leadership is measured by how many people obey, this model measured leadership by how much sacrifice it demanded. Leadership was not giving orders, it was carrying responsibility for consequences other people would feel. Not standing high to be protected, but standing on the front line of trial. Each caliph understood that if the Ummah failed, blame could not be thrown at the public first. It would return to the one at the top. This is the foundation that will shape the entire journey of the four caliphs. They were not the same in personality, and they did not act the same way in every situation. But they were tied together by an invisible thread. The belief that power only matters when it is placed under complete submission to Allah. As long as that thread remains unbroken, the Ummah can endure war, rebellion, and division. When that thread is cut, no empire can save it. So to understand what comes next, hold on to this. The story of the four caliphs is not the story of the strongest men. It is the story of the men most aware of how fragile human power is. They were not chosen because they were perfect, but because they knew how to bow their heads. And from that foundation, four different paths will open, each with its own test, yet all moving toward one purpose: keeping Islam standing when there is no prophet in front. Four men entered history through four different doors, and they did not share the same temperament, the same pace, or the same trials. But that difference is exactly what makes this era the most complete test of leadership in Islam. Because the Ummah did not need one single mold. It needed different ways of carrying responsibility for the same goal. Abu Bakr arrived at the moment everything could collapse from sheer panic. He did not come as a reformer, but as the one who holds the foundation. Before him was a community that had just lost its greatest spiritual anchor. Behind him was the threat of fragmentation, tribes turning away, false claimants of revelation rising, and people trying to renegotiate faith according to emotion. Abu Bakr understood that if Islam was bent at this moment, it would never return to its original shape. So his gentleness was not in compromising principles, but in protecting the full form of faith. He refused to separate what Allah had joined, not because he was rigid, but because if the foundation cracked, everything built on it would fall. Under Abu Bakr, Islam did not become more glamorous, but it remained upright. Umar succeeded him in a different context. The foundation had been secured, but it could not last without order. In Umar, faith began to take the shape of institutions. Not institutions to control people, but to protect them from the arbitrariness of power. Umar did not treat victory as the measure of success. He treated justice as the measure of whether victory was acceptable to Allah. That is why every new land opened brought a heavier question. Who answers if even one person is treated unjustly? Umar did not run from that question. He carried it himself. In his time, and power did not pull leaders away from reality. It dragged them closer to the pain of the people. If Abu Bakr kept Islam from falling apart, Umar made it stand firm. Then came Uthman, and the trial no longer looked like swords. It looked like difference, wealth, and unfamiliar voices echoing from lands Islam had just reached. Uthman stood in the middle of an ummah growing faster than it could adapt. In that context, he saw a quiet danger, division born from different ways of reading what is most sacred. His decision to standardize the Qur'an was not an act of domination. It was an effort to keep the ummah reciting one text, bowing before one source. But his softness was mistaken for weakness. When the storm rose, Uthman did not choose to extinguish it with blood. He chose to let himself become the sacrifice, hoping the ummah would not pay the price through civil war. In Uthman, leadership was not winning, it was enduring. Ali stepped forward when the wound was already deep. He did not inherit a united community, but an ummah pulled in multiple directions, each claiming justice. Ali understood that when truth is dragged into a cyclone of emotion and politics, the one who holds principles becomes isolated. He did not try to please everyone because he knew that was impossible. Instead, he clung to one thing. Justice cannot be built on extremism, and faith cannot be protected by distorting it. His decisions did not produce quick peace. They produced truth, and truth always demands a price. In Ali, leadership was no longer keeping everyone together at any cost. It was keeping the soul of the ummah from being lost, even if it required his life. In these four paths do not contradict each other. They complete each other. Sometimes the ummah needs a man to hold the foundation. Sometimes it needs a man to build order. Sometimes it needs a man to protect unity through patience. And sometimes it needs a man to stand in the storm and say, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Without any one of these paths, the picture of leadership would be incomplete. This is where the greatest value of this era becomes clear. Islam did not depend on one single type of person to survive. It survived through loyalty to principle, even when principle took different forms. The four caliphs were not the same, but they met in one place. They all placed obedience to Allah above their own safety. From that meeting point, history moved forward not through sameness, but through responsibility carried in different ways, aimed at one purpose. History often draws our attention to enemies from the outside, armies marching in, empires colliding, swords and banners. But the era of the four caliphs exposes a harder truth. The most dangerous test does not always come as an enemy. Sometimes it comes as the community itself. Fitnah does not arrive with hoofbeats. It arrives through quiet fractures in understanding, emotion, and the way people speak in the name of faith. Fitnah is not random chaos. It is the state where sacred values are pulled out of their proper order. When justice is cut off from knowledge, it becomes blind judgment. When faith is cut off from humility, it becomes a weapon. And when every group believes it represents absolute truth, the Ummah is no longer facing disagreement. It is facing self-destruction. What makes fitnah especially dangerous is that it never introduces itself as wrong. It wraps itself in the language of morality. Every side quotes the Qur'an. Every group speaks of justice. Every slogan claims Allah. The difference is this: faith is separated from wisdom and justice is separated from mercy. When those two do not walk together, what remains is a cold rigidity, ready to crush anything in its path. In this era, the Ummah tasted a painful paradox. People who prayed toward the same direction could stand against each other on a battlefield. People who heard the same teachings could interpret them in ways that led to bloodshed. Even worse, many began to believe that harsher means more righteous, that removing the other side means protecting faith. In that atmosphere, the fitnah grows like a fever that is hard to diagnose because its symptoms can look like religious zeal. The caliphs did not face fitnah like they faced a traditional enemy. There was no clear border to defend, no single opponent to defeat. Fitnah lives in speech, in rumors, in emotional calls that lack depth. It spreads faster than truth because it hits fear and anger directly. And once people start acting from emotion instead of principle, consequences slip out of control. Ali ibn Abi Talib carried the heaviest weight of this period, not because he was weak, but because he refused to reduce a complex crisis into simple slogans. In his time, fitnah was not only political instability, it was a moral collapse. Some demanded immediate justice without caring about outcomes. Some called for order at any cost, even if truth had to be sacrificed. And some extremist groups believed that if they invoked Allah, every action became justified. Ali stood between those forces with a position that made him isolated. Justice cannot be achieved by breaking the foundational principles of faith. He understood that if the Ummah won through extremism, that would not be victory, it would be deformation. So he resisted interpretations that turned the Qur'an into a tool of exclusion. And that resistance cost him support from people who wanted solutions that were fast, clear, and ruthless. Fitnah also revealed another truth. Not everyone who speaks loudly about faith protects faith. Some recite the Qur'an but never let it reach the heart. Some demand perfect purity from others while failing to see how their own rigidity is poisoning their soul. When morality becomes a measuring stick to condemn instead of a light to guide, the community begins tearing itself apart. In that environment, leadership becomes nearly impossible. Any decision can be framed as betrayal. Silence is labeled weakness. Action is labeled tyranny. But the most dangerous thing is not criticism. The most dangerous thing is allowing fitnah to define right and wrong. The caliphs understood that if they accepted the logic of fitnah, they might win arguments, but they would lose their moral core. This era leaves behind a bitter lesson we cannot ignore. The Ummah can survive war, poverty, and oppression, but it can collapse quickly when it loses the balance between faith and wisdom. Fitnah does not destroy a community by brute force. It destroys it by distortion of understanding. And when that distortion wears sacred clothing, correcting it becomes far harder. That is why the story of fitnah is not only past tense, it is a warning across time. Whenever justice is separated from mercy, whenever faith is used to exclude instead of to heal, fitnah returns. And then the question is not simply who is right and who is wrong, but whether the community still has the clarity to recognize that its most dangerous enemy is speaking in its own language. When the final pages of this era close, what remains is not a map of territory and not a list of battles. What remains longest is a model of leadership etched not in ink, but in sacrifice, tears, and the fear of Allah. The four caliphs did not leave the Ummah an easy legacy to admire. They left a legacy that is hard to live up to, and that is exactly why it still matters. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali were not the same, but they shared one unmistakable trait. They never treated power as something that belonged to them. Each of them knew the role they held was temporary, while Allah's judgment is forever. So they did not rule to be remembered. They ruled with the fear that they would be questioned down to the smallest detail on the day of judgment. That fear kept their hearts soft even when they had to make hard decisions. Their legacy is not perfection. They are not presented as men who never failed. In fact, the fact that they had to face mistakes, doubt, and pain is what makes their example real. The Ummah was not given a myth to worship. It was given human beings to follow, with all the fragility of being human and the greatness of responsibility. And what makes their legacy remarkable is how they understood service. In a world where leadership is measured by how many people bow, the four caliphs measured leadership by how many nights they lost for others. They did not live above the community. They lived heavier than the community. Every privilege they had was balanced by severe self-discipline. Every decision was examined not only for short-term benefit, but for long-term moral consequence. That is why their story did not end when they died. It continues to echo in every age, especially in ages of crisis. Whenever the community argues over power, their story reminds us that power does not save faith. Whenever people use justice to justify cruelty, their legacy reminds us that justice cannot exist without mercy. And whenever stability is bought by silence in the face of wrongdoing, and their lives stand as a rebuttal that does not need a speech. They also left a harder lesson. Unity does not always look like surface-level peace. Sometimes holding to principle exposes cracks that already exist. But hiding those cracks through moral compromise only delays collapse and makes it more painful when it comes. Their legacy teaches that the price of truth can be instability, but the price of losing truth is far greater. Looking back, the Ummah was not promised an easy road. It was given a standard. That standard does not change with the times. It does not bend with circumstances. It demands that a leader be the first to carry responsibility, the last to benefit, and always willing to be misunderstood if that protects principle. This is not a model for people seeking comfort, and it is a model for people courageous enough to place obedience to Allah above personal ease. Their legacy places one unavoidable question before every generation. When we face the choice between what is right and what is easy, which road will we take? Because the tests they faced did not vanish with time. They changed shape. Power still tempts. Extremism still dresses itself in moral language, and people still prefer quick solutions over right solutions. So the four caliphs are not just four historical figures, they are four mirrors for the conscience. Whenever the Ummah loses its way, returning to their legacy is not about romanticizing the past. It is about asking where we stand now. Not to collect names to praise, but to measure the distance between our words and our actions. In the end, what they left behind was not a ready-made answer for every era, but a path. That path is not paved with power or glory, but with submission, humility, and responsibility. Whoever walks it learns that real leadership is not ruling others, but mastering oneself. That is the deepest legacy the four caliphs handed to the Ummah. A legacy that never grows old because it always challenges people to live better than yesterday. This story ends, but the question it asks does not. When there is no prophet standing in front of us to point the way, every generation must ask, what will we hold faith with? Power, numbers, or character? Because history has made one thing clear. Communities do not collapse for lack of strength. They collapse for lack of people brave enough to do what is right when doing what is right becomes inconvenient. And if you want to keep going deeper into lessons of history, faith, and leadership from the prophets, the companions, and the pivotal eras of Islam, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can learn, reflect, and discuss together. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us. Every subscription helps us keep producing videos that are deeper, more honest, and more valuable in the time ahead. Your support is how these stories keep being told, not only for today, but for the generations that come after.